In this video, we're going to look at calculating the arc length of a sector if you're given either its arc length or an area, along with either the radius or the diameter. So an example of that would be here in this first question. We are given the sector of a circle. We are told its arc length is 7 centimetres, and we know the radius of the sector here is 16 centimetres, but we're trying to find this angle here. Now the formula we've been using so far, that's what we're going to write down. Because this question gives me the arc length, I'm going to use the arc length formula rather than the area of a sector formula. So I'm going to quickly write that out now. And the next step is to then start to fill in all of the things I know. Now there are a couple of things I can fill in here. The arc length I know is 7. The angle I don't know, but it's marked as an x here, so I could change that to an x. Pi is a constant that never changes, so it's always going to stay as pi, and d is the diameter, and I can certainly work out the diameter because I know the radius here. So let's start to fill these in. Arc length is 7, so that will become, instead of arc length equals, it will become 7 equals. The angle is marked with an x, so instead of angle over 360, we're going to put x over 360, and then times pi times d. Now the diameter here that I'm going to replace, we know the radius is 16 centimetres, which means the diameter is double that, that's 32. So what we actually end up with is we end up with an equation here that we could solve. Now this equation has a fraction in it. Anytime I've got an equation which has a fraction in it, the first thing I generally want to do is get rid of the fraction if I can. So because at the moment we're dividing by 360, I want something that will undo this division by 360 or get rid of this division by 360. Now the opposite of dividing something by 360 is to multiply it by 360. So because it's an equation, I have to do the same thing to both sides. So if I want to multiply this side by 360, I'll have to multiply this side here by 360 as well. So starting with the left hand side, 7 times 360. I'm not going to bother calculating it just yet, I'm just going to write out 7 times 360. And on the right hand side, what happens is when I multiply by 360, it just cancels out this division by 360. So this bottom part here will just disappear, and what I'll be left with is I'll simply be left with the top part here. All of the stuff I've highlighted will be left over. So we're going to write that out just now. So that's multiplying that by 360 would leave me x times pi times 32. The next step is to try and get the x on its own. Now at the moment this x is being multiplied by pi and 32. Now I can group this together and say, well, I'm multiplying x by pi times 32. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually get rid of that by doing the opposite, which means dividing by this pi times 32. In other words, I'm going to think of this as one thing here that's multiplying x, and I'm going to divide both sides by it. So when I divide the left hand side here by this, I'm just going to write this divided by this, but I'm going to write it as a fraction because that's another way of writing division. So I'm going to write 7 times 360 divided by pi times 32. And because I've divided the other side by this as well, that will cancel this out, and I'll just be left with the x. So I can write x equals. Now what I've got here, x equals all of this. I can use my calculator to type this in. There is an important thing you need to remember with your calculators when you are typing this in, and that's that you always put brackets around the top of the fraction and brackets around the bottom. If you don't do that, in most cases the calculator, depending on your make and model, will give you the wrong answer here. So as long as you've got brackets grouping the top and the bottom, then you shouldn't have any problems. So when we type that into our calculator, we end up with 25.07. Now remember, x here is an angle, so we'll put a little degree symbol there, and that's me basically done it. The important thing here just to remember is draw out the formula, write or fill in all of the parts that you know the arc length, you know the diameter, and then just solve the equation. If you've got an equation with a fraction in it, multiply both sides by the denominator to get rid of that fraction. So multiply both sides by 360, that gives me this, and it cancels out the 360 here, leaving me with all of this. Then I look at what's multiplying x. It's been multiplied by everything here, so divide both sides by everything in this red patch here, and I end up with that divided by what was in the red patch, and that's equal to x. And then just really important, when you are typing it into your calculator, make sure you put brackets around the top of the fraction and brackets around the bottom. Remember, the fraction can just be a divide on your calculator, you don't need to make it look like a fraction. We'll do another example quickly here. It's slightly different this time because the question gives me the area of the sector is 27 square centimetres. That means inside here the area is 27 square centimetres. The radius is 10 centimetres, which is shown in the diagram, and it's asking me to calculate the size of angle x, so this angle here. Now again, I need one of my two formulas for either arc length or area of a sector. I'm going to look at the question again. It's giving me the area of the sector, so it makes sense that that's the formula I'm going to use here. So I'm going to write out my area of a sector formula, and then I'm going to start to fill in the parts that I know. So starting with this side, area of a sector, well, it tells me here the area of a sector is 27, so I can replace that area of a sector with 27 equals, it's then angle over 360. Now the angle is here as an x, so I'm going to make that angle x over 360 instead. I'm then going to do times pi times, and the next part that's a variable here, this r squared, that stands for radius, and the radius here is 10. It tells me here. It also sometimes will tell you in the question as well. So that's pi times r squared becomes pi times 10 squared, like this. Now what I'm going to do again is I've got an equation now that I need to solve for x. First thing I want to do, anytime I see a fraction in an equation, I'm generally going to try and get rid of it. So because I'm dividing by 360 here, I need to get rid of that by multiplying both sides by 360. So multiply the first side by 360, it will become 27 times 360. And multiplying the second side by 360, remember that will effectively just cancel out the division by 360, and what I'll be left with is this bit here. So again, multiplying this by 360 will just cancel out this division here, and I'll be left with this. So I can just write out what's at the top there, x times pi times 10 squared. And the next step is to try and get the x on its own. Look at what's actually multiplying the x. The x has been multiplied by all of this. So what I need to do here is divide both sides by all of this. Now the left hand side there, that 27 times 360, I'm going to write that as 27 times 360 divided by all of pi times 10 squared, and that will leave me with just x at this side when I divide. I'm then going to turn it around, x equals, and I'm going to type it into my calculator. Now again, it might not work properly unless on your calculator you put brackets around the top of the fraction and brackets around the bottom. That's really important. So typing that into my calculator, and I end up with 30.94 degrees. Here's a question for you to try yourself. So pause the video, try the question, and then when you're ready to go over it, press play. First thing you need to do is think about which formula you're going to use. Give you a clue. This here, that 6 is an arc length. They're giving you an arc length in the question. That'll help you decide on the formula. Okay, ready to go over it. Then it is arc length is the one we're going to use because we're given the arc length. So arc length equals angle over 360 times pi d. Remember, the next step is to fill in all of the parts you know. So the arc length, first of all, the arc length is 6, so this arc length here can be replaced with 6 equals instead of arc length equals. The angle is just x in this case, so instead of angle over 360, I can write x over 360. And then it's times pi times d for diameter. And what we've got up here is we have this 9 centimetres, but this 9 centimetres, remember, this is not the diameter. The centre of the circle would be here, so this is a radius. So to get the diameter, we're just going to double that. Diameter is always 2 times the length of the radius, so 2 nines are 18, meaning my diameter is 18. Now, when we get to this stage, again, it's an equation, but it's got a fraction in it. Anytime we've got an equation with a fraction in it, let's get rid of the fraction. So I want to undo this division by 360 we see here by multiplying both sides by 360. So that's 6 times 360 on this side. And remember, when I multiply through this other side by 360, it just cancels out the bottom of that fraction, so I'll be left with everything else though. So that'll be, let's see, x multiplied by pi multiplied by 18. We've then got to look at what is the x being multiplied by. So the x is being multiplied by this pi times 18 here, so I need to divide both sides by that. So I'm going to do that next. 6 times 360 divided by pi times 18, and when I divide this side over here by the pi times 18, it just gets rid of this multiplication by pi times 18, so I'm just left with then x at this side. Flip sides around and then type into your calculator. Remember, brackets around the top and brackets around the bottom, and that gives me 38.2 degrees, and that's just one decimal place. you might have had 38.20 to 2 decimal places, but that's the answer.